They say success is a shining crown, something the world admires when it rests upon someone's head. But what if behind that crown lies a secret no one dares to talk about? What if every triumph, every breakthrough, every revolution that changed lives began not with glory, but with betrayal, heartbreak, and the raw pain of being broken? This is not a story about comfort. It is a story about wounds so deep they demand transformation, about shadows we cannot escape, and about the hidden truth behind success that no textbook, no seminar, and no motivational quote ever tells you. To understand the real engine of greatness, we must step into the darkest corridors of the human soul, where suffering forges identity and betrayal sparks revolutions. It begins with a young man named Daniel, born into a family that prized achievement above all else. His father was a stern businessman, a man who believed worth was measured in results, not emotions. His mother, gentle but distant, never dared to challenge the rules of their home. Daniel grew up chasing approval, always striving to prove that he was worthy of love. Yet, even as he excelled academically and socially, he felt the gnawing emptiness inside him, as though he were playing a role in someone else's script rather than writing his own. For years, he ignored the whispers of his true self, burying his insecurities beneath the pursuit of excellence. He thought success meant filling the void, but the void only grew larger. The turning point came when Daniel entered the corporate world. At only 27 years old, he secured a position at a prestigious firm, one that promised him recognition and financial security. He worked tirelessly, sacrificing sleep, relationships, and his health in exchange for praise. But the higher he climbed, the lonelier he became. The mask he wore in public grew heavier with each passing day, until one morning at 7:30 a.m., his carefully constructed world shattered. He discovered that a colleague he had trusted deeply had betrayed him, stealing credit for a major project and feeding lies to their superiors. Daniel was blindsided. Overnight, his reputation was tarnished, his standing in the company reduced to rubble. Betrayal cut deeper than failure ever could. It was not just the loss of status. It was the loss of identity. That moment, though devastating, became the seed of transformation. As Daniel sat alone in his apartment staring at the ceiling through sleepless nights, he began to confront a truth he had long avoided. He had been living as a shadow of himself, defined by others' approval, chained to their expectations. The betrayal forced him to look inward, to face the part of himself he had always suppressed. It was in this darkness that he encountered what Carl Jung once called the shadow self, the rejected, hidden aspects of who we are. For Daniel, the shadow was his rage, his vulnerability, his longing to be authentic without fear of judgment. And as he faced it, he realized that success was never about climbing ladders for applause. It was about integrating the broken pieces of his soul into something whole. This is the hidden truth behind success. It is born, not from perfection, but from the integration of wounds. Daniel's journey mirrors countless others throughout history. Think of Viktor Frankl, who endured unimaginable suffering in concentration camps and emerged with a philosophy that transformed psychology. Think of Nelson Mandela, who spent 27 years in prison, betrayed by systems meant to protect freedom, and yet emerged as a leader of reconciliation. Their stories, like Daniel's, are not tales of smooth paths or lucky breaks. They are stories of betrayal becoming the spark that ignites inner revolution, suffering becoming the currency of authenticity, and wounds becoming the birthplace of strength. As Daniel rebuilt his life, he did not begin with ambition. He began with honesty. He journaled late into the night, confronting memories he had buried, writing down not only his hopes but also his fears. He sought therapy, where he learned that every unacknowledged wound holds power over us until we face it. Slowly, he began to reconstruct an identity not based on pleasing others but on living in alignment with his values. His career took a new direction, not in the corporate ladder he once idolized, but in a path of leadership that inspired others to embrace their own shadows. People were drawn to him, not because he was flawless, but because he was real. The story you are about to hear is not Daniel's alone. It is the story of anyone who has ever been betrayed, broken, or abandoned, only to discover that the very pain they wished away became the foundation for their greatest triumphs. It is a story about you, about me, about every human being walking through the crucible of life, carrying wounds that can either destroy us or transform us. The hidden truth behind success is not that we avoid suffering, but that we learn to use it. And it always begins with a betrayal that forces us to wake up. Daniel's sleepless nights became a classroom where his pain taught lessons no mentor could. Each thought, each memory seemed to circle back to the same question. Why do the wounds cut so deeply? Why does betrayal leave scars that achievement can never erase? He turned to books for answers, stumbling upon the writings of Carl Jung, whose ideas about the shadow and the wounded healer struck him like lightning. For the first time, Daniel saw his suffering not as weakness but as a gateway. Jung believed that those who are deeply sensitive, those who feel pain with unbearable intensity, carry within them a paradox, the potential to transform wounds into wisdom, or the risk of drowning in their own despair. Jung called this the path of individuation, the process of becoming whole by integrating what we reject in ourselves. The idea unsettled Daniel. It meant his pain was not just a misfortune, it was a task. The betrayal he suffered was not merely a setback, it was an initiation. Yet the very thought of embracing his shadow terrified him. His anger, for instance, felt dangerous. He feared that if he unleashed it, he would become cruel, like the father who had scolded him without mercy. For years, Daniel had equated strength with abuse, power with oppression. To him, being good meant swallowing his voice, sacrificing his needs, and pleasing others at the expense of himself. But Jung's words lingered. To deny the shadow is to deny wholeness. Could it be that the qualities he feared, anger, assertiveness, power, were not destructive by nature, but simply tools misused by those who had hurt him? He began small experiments. In therapy sessions, he practiced saying no, declining requests he would once have accepted to avoid conflict. At first, guilt gnawed at him. He imagined people would see him as selfish or ungrateful. But when the world did not collapse, when his friends respected his honesty rather than condemning it, something shifted inside him. He realized that boundaries were not walls to keep people out, but filters to allow healthier connections in. The very power he feared was the key to protecting his sensitivity, ensuring it did not drown him but instead guided him. This process was not without turmoil. Late at night, he often felt torn between two selves, the old Daniel who thrived on approval and the emerging Daniel who dared to honor his truth. He wrestled with what Jung described as identity terror, the fear of losing who we think we are when we step into who we could become. At times, Daniel longed for the comfort of his old victimhood. There was safety in being powerless. If he remained the betrayed, the broken, then no one could expect him to risk, to lead, to shine. But as he weighed the cost, he saw clearly. Staying in the wound meant living half a life, forever shadowed by someone else's betrayal. The transformation gained momentum when Daniel noticed how others responded. Colleagues began seeking him out, not because of his old corporate achievements, but because he carried a presence that felt authentic. He no longer pretended to be flawless. Instead, he spoke openly about the lessons he learned from pain. People trusted him because he was real. And in that authenticity, Daniel found something more powerful than approval: connection. For the first time, he was not admired for the mask he wore, but for the truth he revealed. Jung had once written that the greatest danger for sensitive individuals is not external harm, but the internal refusal to heal. Daniel saw this clearly now. He thought back to moments when he had clung to suffering, believing it gave him identity and value. He realized that many people, like the patient Jung had described, confuse their wounds with their worth. They fear that healing will strip them of uniqueness, that letting go of pain means letting go of the very thing that makes them special. Daniel understood this intimately, for he had resisted healing too. But standing on the other side, he knew the truth. Wounds do not disappear when healed, they transform. They become wisdom, a source of empathy and strength that no applause or betrayal can erase. Still, the path was perilous. With each step forward, Daniel encountered new tests. Old friends grew uncomfortable with his changes, accusing him of arrogance when he set boundaries. withdrawing when he refused to play the role of the self-sacrificing confidant. At work, too, his newfound assertiveness threatened colleagues who once relied on his compliance. Some even tried to sabotage him again, but this time he was different. He was no longer fueled by the need for approval. He was rooted in a deeper purpose, to live as himself, whole and unmasked. The betrayal that once broke him had forged a resilience no external force could shake. Through this, Daniel discovered a profound paradox. The very sensitivity that had made him vulnerable to betrayal was the same gift that allowed him to grow beyond it. When combined with strength, empathy became not a weakness but a superpower. He could sense the unspoken struggles of those around him, but he no longer absorbed their pain as his own. Instead, he offered presence, guidance, and boundaries, embodying what Jung described as the integrated warrior. This was not the warrior who conquered others, but the one who conquered his own shadows, and yet, Daniel knew he was only halfway through the journey. Integration was not a single victory but a lifelong process. The shadow would always be there, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting to teach, but he had crossed the threshold. He was no longer the wounded victim defined by betrayal. He was becoming something greater, a man who turned his pain into power, his suffering into strength, his wounds into wisdom. The seasons turned, and with them Daniel's world began to reshape itself. What had once felt like rubble after betrayal slowly became fertile ground for something new. He noticed that his mornings were different, less about rushing to prove his worth, more about listening to what stirred inside him. At 6 a.m., he would rise not to chase deadlines but to journal, capturing fragments of thought and emotion before the noise of the day set in. These private reflections became a dialogue with his soul, guiding him toward questions that mattered. What do I truly want? What does success mean if not applause? Where is the line between ambition and authenticity? Answers did not arrive quickly, but the act of asking was enough to pull him forward. Slowly, Daniel realized that his vision of success had been inherited, not chosen. For years, he had absorbed the voices of mentors, colleagues, even family, all of whom equated achievement with external validation, titles, income, prestige. Yet when he peeled those layers away, he found no joy in them. His deepest fulfillment came not from recognition, but from resonance. He wanted his life to echo with meaning, to create ripples that touched others not with envy but with inspiration. This shift, though subtle, altered everything. At work, Daniel's approach began to stand out. Instead of competing for the spotlight, he directed energy toward collaboration, lifting others rather than outshining them. Ironically, the less he sought recognition, the more respect he earned. People began describing him as someone who brought calm clarity to chaos, someone whose presence made others feel grounded. It wasn't leadership by dominance but by authenticity. And though some colleagues resisted, accusing him of being too idealistic, Daniel felt an unshakable confidence that he was finally aligned with something greater than ambition. But even as external changes unfolded, the deeper battle remained within. Shadows still rose in moments of stress. At 11 p.m., when fatigue lowered his defenses, memories of betrayal sometimes flooded back with venomous clarity, the mocking laughter, the whispers of those who had turned against him. He would feel the old rage clawing for release, the desire to prove them wrong by any means necessary. In those moments, it was tempting to slip back into old patterns, to fight for validation rather than truth. Yet Daniel had learned enough to pause. He would breathe, acknowledge the pain, and remind himself, this is the shadow speaking. It does not need to be banished, only understood. Each time he did this, the rage softened, losing its grip, becoming not a master but a messenger. Around this time, Daniel began to mentor younger professionals who, like him, carried wounds of rejection and betrayal. He did not set out to become a guide. It happened naturally. People saw in him someone who understood their struggles without judgment. They confided in him about toxic workplaces, about parents who never listened, about the crushing weight of expectations. Instead of offering quick fixes, Daniel listened deeply, reflecting their pain back to them with empathy but also with challenge. He urged them to face their shadows, to recognize that betrayal, though devastating, can be a forge. Some resisted, clinging to their wounds as he once had. Others embraced the path and found courage they never knew they possessed. Watching them grow gave Daniel a sense of purpose far beyond what corporate titles ever offered. One evening, after a long conversation with a young woman who was considering leaving her job after a humiliating betrayal by a manager, Daniel walked home under the glow of city lights. He thought of Jung's words again. The greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved but only outgrown. For the first time he understood them fully. Betrayal was not a problem to solve, not a puzzle with a neat resolution. It was a condition of being human, an unavoidable encounter with the shadows of others and oneself. The task was not to fix it but to grow beyond it, to outgrow the pain without denying it, to carry its lessons without letting it dictate the future. The realization brought peace but also a sober responsibility. Growth demanded vigilance. Daniel could not assume the work was done, that he had arrived. He saw too many examples of leaders who preached resilience while secretly remaining prisoners of their wounds. He vowed not to fall into that trap. For him, authenticity meant admitting the journey was ongoing, that wholeness is never final but a practice renewed each day. Months later, an unexpected opportunity emerged. A publisher approached Daniel after hearing him speak at a leadership retreat, inviting him to write about his experiences. The thought terrified him. To lay his story bare on paper meant risking exposure, criticism, even mockery, but another voice inside whispered, "This is the next threshold." The betrayal that once silenced him had forged a message too powerful to hoard. Writing would not erase his scars, but it could transform them into maps for others still wandering in the dark. After nights of hesitation, Daniel agreed. The manuscript took shape slowly, born of early mornings and late nights, weaving personal narrative with reflections on shadow, pain, and growth. As the pages filled, Daniel felt both vulnerable and liberated. Each word was an act of defiance against the betrayal that once crushed him, proof that his voice could rise stronger than silence. He realized that what began as personal healing was now rippling outward into something collective. The reception surprised him. Messages poured in from strangers across the world who had found themselves in his story. A teacher in India wrote about a colleague who had betrayed her trust, leaving her broken until she discovered resilience through Daniel's words. A businessman in South Africa confessed that he had betrayed a partner and carried guilt for years, but reading the book inspired him to seek forgiveness. Even a soldier in South America reached out, saying that Daniel's reflections helped him cope with the disillusionment of betrayal within his unit. These voices were diverse, yet they harmonized around a single truth. Betrayal is universal, but it does not have to be final. Each testimony reinforced Daniel's belief that pain, when transformed, becomes a bridge between souls. With this recognition came invitations to speak publicly. At first, Daniel hesitated, standing on a stage facing hundreds of expectant eyes, threatened to reignite old insecurities. Would his words sound hollow? Would critics dismiss him as naive? But when he stepped onto the stage for the first time, looking out at an audience waiting not for perfection but for honesty, he felt the fear dissolve. He spoke not as an expert but as a fellow traveler. He shared the story of betrayal, the nights of despair, the battle with shadows, and the quiet emergence of a new kind of strength. As he spoke, he saw tears in some eyes, nods of recognition in others. When the applause came, it was not thunderous or grand, it was steady, sincere, and deeply human. In that moment, Daniel understood that his voice had found its place, yet success did not shield him from further trials. Betrayal, he realized, is not a singular event but a recurring element of human relationships. Old colleagues resurfaced, some with veiled envy, others with genuine curiosity. A few accused him of exploiting his pain for profit, mocking his authenticity. At first their words stung, reopening scars he thought had healed. But instead of spiraling into rage or defensiveness, Daniel paused, breathed, and remembered. The shadow must be faced, not feared. He recognized their accusations for what they were, projections of their own wounds. And so, rather than lashing out, he responded with clarity, sometimes with silence. In doing so, he discovered that resilience was not about hardening against pain, but about softening into wisdom. This new resilience carried over into his relationships. For years, betrayal had left him wary, reluctant to trust deeply, but gradually he allowed himself to open again. He cultivated friendships grounded not in utility or ambition, but in mutual respect and vulnerability. He even fell in love, though cautiously, with someone who admired his authenticity more than his achievements. This relationship was not free of conflict, but it was built on transparency, a willingness to confront shadows together rather than hide them. For Daniel, this was perhaps the greatest revolution of all, learning that intimacy after betrayal was not only possible, but profoundly healing. As his influence grew, Daniel often reflected on the paradox of his journey. The very thing that once threatened to destroy him, the betrayal that shattered his trust, had become the catalyst for transformation. It had stripped away illusions, forcing him to confront truths he might otherwise have ignored. It had exposed his shadows but also revealed his light. He realized that betrayal, though cruel, carries within it the seed of renewal. The revolution it sparks is not one of anger but of awakening. Without it, he might have continued chasing hollow victories, mistaking applause for purpose. With it, he discovered a life infused with authenticity, connection, and meaning. One night, after returning from a speaking engagement, Daniel sat alone by the window, watching the city hum beneath the stars. He thought of the countless people out there enduring their own betrayals, some fresh, some old, all painful. He wished he could reach each one, place a hand on their shoulder, and tell them what he had learned. That betrayal is not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new chapter. That the wound which feels unbearable today may one day become the source of strength tomorrow. That within the ashes of trust lies the possibility of transformation, if only they dare to face the fire. This reflection filled him with gratitude, not for the betrayal itself, it would be dishonest to romanticize it, but for the journey it compelled him to take. The revolution it sparked was not about vengeance or victory, but about wholeness, and as he gazed at the skyline, he knew the work was far from over. Each day would bring new shadows, new trials, and perhaps even new betrayals. But he no longer feared them. Instead, he welcomed them as teachers, reminders that growth is never finished, that authenticity is a lifelong practice. Years later, Daniel found himself standing in a quiet garden outside a retreat center, far removed from the chaos of the city. He had been invited to lead a seminar on resilience, and as he prepared his closing remarks, he reflected on the arc of his own story. The path from betrayal to revolution had been neither straight nor smooth. It had been marked by detours through despair, storms of self-doubt, and moments where giving up felt easier than pressing forward. And yet, looking back now, he would not have changed it. Without those dark passages, the light he carried today would not exist. The retreat gathered people of every background, teachers, artists, entrepreneurs, caregivers, all united by the invisible thread of pain. During the final circle, one woman, her voice trembling, shared how her business partner had stolen everything, leaving her in ruins. Daniel listened, recognizing himself in her story. When she asked, "How do you trust again?" he paused, choosing his words with care. He told her that trust was not about pretending betrayal had never happened, nor about blindly opening herself to anyone who asked. Trust, he explained, was about courage, the courage to risk vulnerability again, knowing that pain may come, but also knowing that life without connection is emptier still. As she nodded, tears streaming down her face, Daniel felt a profound sense of alignment. His suffering had not been wasted. It had become nourishment for others. That evening, as the group dispersed, Daniel lingered in the garden, watching the sun melt into the horizon. The air smelled of earth and rain, and for a moment he closed his eyes, remembering the boy who had once been consumed by silence, the boy who had been crushed by betrayal, certain that life had lost its meaning. He realized now that he had not escaped that boy. He had integrated him. Every scar, every tear, every sleepless night was part of the foundation upon which he now stood. The revolution had not been about conquering the world outside, but about reconciling the world within. In the months that followed, Daniel poured these reflections into his second book. Unlike the first, which was raw and urgent, this one was gentler, more contemplative. It explored not only the pain of betrayal, but also the joy of rediscovery, the quiet beauty of choosing trust after devastation. Critics hailed it as wiser, more mature, a sign that Daniel had evolved from survivor to sage. But Daniel cared less about the accolades than the letters from readers who wrote things like, "Your words helped me forgive," or "I can finally breathe again." These messages reminded him that stories are not ends in themselves, but vessels carrying hope from one heart to another. Through it all, Daniel remained grounded. Fame never seduced him, nor did he hunger for wealth. He lived simply, valuing meaningful conversations over material possessions, choosing depth over distraction. What he desired most was to remain true to the lesson life had carved into him. That betrayal, though it cuts deeply, can awaken us to a strength we never imagined. And that success, stripped of illusions, is not about power or applause, but about authenticity, service, and love. One night after delivering a keynote lecture, Daniel returned to his apartment and sat by his desk, gazing at the city lights. His phone buzzed with messages of praise, but he set it aside. He picked up a notebook and wrote a single line. The hidden truth behind success is that it is born not of